Dr. Edwards, how quickly can Australia's economy return to pre-COVID levels and, as you say, exceed them?
Well, I think we're pretty much at pre-COVID levels already. It's probably the case that output in the quarter just ending is higher than it's ever been. And we know that the number of jobs in February was back to where it was in February 2020. So in some important respects, we're already back to where we were, and possibly a little bit further on.
Will this crisis and the recovery that we're clearly in increase the divide between those who have and those who don't in this country?
Well, it's certainly doing so in respect of house prices. It's very interesting that household wealth in Australia today has never been higher. That dipped slightly during the pandemic and is now back up again. And a lot of that's house prices. So if you own a house, you're in front, and if you don't own a house, you're behind. So that's a great source of inequality. And it's also the case, of course, that people who've been disadvantaged by the pandemic, people in food services, tourism and so forth, they're going to have a hard time making up for lost ground.
A lot of those people that you speak of are those who've been supported by government stimulus, particularly JobKeeper. Now, we saw that wind back in the last couple of days, despite 1 million people still on that wage support. Was now the right time to pull that back?
It's not just JobKeeper, it's that even in February, when the number of jobs was back to where it was a year earlier, the number of unemployed was 100,000 higher. And meanwhile, we decided, well, the unemployment rate that we had going into the pandemic was too high anyway, and we want to take it down. So all up, we've got a deficit of something like 300,000 jobs we need to make up over the next few years. It's a big ask.
If you were still on the Reserve Bank board, would you have done what we've seen it do to handle the pandemic?
I do applaud the RBA for moving as rapidly as it did, not just to cutting rates, because actually it didn't have all that much room to cut the short-term rate, but to intervene in the bond market to buy bonds. It's more than trebled its holding of Australian dollar investments over the last year.
How much of the rate cuts, the bond buying, was of its own doing, or because its hand was forced by the movement of other central banks?
Oh, it's certainly in response to other central banks doing the same, but that's forced on the bank because it would otherwise see an unacceptable increase in the Australian dollar, which would hurt our exports. So it's true, if other central banks hadn't done it, the RBA mightn't have had to do it, or not quite so much, but they have, and the RBA has responded.
Australia is a country reliant on trade. When the pandemic hit and the first rumblings of supply chain issues started to mount, there was a lot of speculation countries would shorten those supply chains. Do you see this being the impetus for any long-term change to those supply chains, and what impact would that have for Australia?
Well, shortening supply chains is really another way of saying reducing global trade. But what we've actually seen, to my astonishment, is that global trade in January of this year was higher than it had ever been. And so was global industrial production. I don't think there's really much evidence that supply chains are being shortened or that globalisation is under threat. In fact, I rather think the episode demonstrates how strong globalisation is.
Dr. John Edwards, thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Pleasure.